He had never paid much attention to the old cabin at the edge of the forest. It had been empty for years, worn down by rain and time, sitting quietly on a forgotten patch of land. But when he returned to this place, it felt like stepping back into a part of himself he hadn't visited in a long time. He was tired, more tired than usual, not just from the long drive, but from the weight of everything happening in his life. A few months ago, he lost his job. The kind of job that gave you stability and routine. Without it, the days felt slow and empty, like the silence around the cabin. He had come here to find peace or maybe answers. The house had belonged to his grandfather, a man he barely knew. When his grandfather passed away, the cabin was left to him, and with it, a chance to escape the noise of the city and the confusion of his mind. The forest stretched in all directions, tall trees standing like quiet sentinels. The air smelled fresh but carried a strange weight, a mixture of old wood, earth, and forgotten stories. He decided to walk around the property, letting the rough ground under his boots remind him he was still alive. His eyes caught sight of a large oak tree near the porch. It was old, its bark cracked and darkened, branches bare and brittle. It looked sick, like it had been fighting the elements for decades and was losing. For a moment he thought about climbing up and sitting in the branches like he used to as a child, but he knew that tree was dying. He pulled out his old chainsaw from the shed. It had seen better days, but it still worked. The idea was simple: cut down the tree, clear the space, maybe plant something new. He didn't expect what happened next. The first cuts were easy, the chainsaw biting through the thick bark and soft wood. The sound of the saw was loud in the quiet forest. Wood chips flew around as he worked steadily, lost in the rhythm of the task. After a few minutes, he reached a hollow inside the trunk, a dark space hidden beneath layers of bark and wood. That's when the chainsaw hit something hard. He stopped immediately, his heart skipping a beat. Curious, he reached into the hollow and pulled out a small metal box, rusty and covered with dirt. The box looked old, like it had been there for years, forgotten and hidden. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped off the dirt and tried to open it. The lock was stiff, but after a few moments it gave way with a quiet click. Inside there was a stack of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed, edges curled, but the handwriting was clear, careful. Flowing script. He pulled out the first letter and began to read. The words were filled with emotion. A woman writing to a man, sharing secrets, dreams, and regrets. She called him Elias, and the letters were dated back to the early 1970s. He had never heard of Elias before. Could this be his grandfather? The thought made his hands shake as he read more. The letters spoke of a love that was complicated and hidden. The woman, who signed only as M.H., wrote about meeting Elias in secret, the pain of being apart, and hopes of a future that never came. There were mentions of a child, a promise to return, and fears of betrayal. He couldn't stop reading. Each letter pulled him deeper into a story he never knew existed. Why had his grandfather kept these letters hidden? Why were they inside the tree, buried away from the world? His mind raced with questions. He looked around the quiet forest, feeling as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. In one of the last letters, the woman wrote about waiting by the tree, this very tree, on a certain day, hoping Elias would come. If he didn't, she would know it was the end. He closed the letter and stared at the old tree. So much pain, so many secrets, all hidden here, waiting for someone to find them. That night he sat by the cabin, the box of letters on the table in front of him. He felt a strange connection to the woman who wrote them, a stranger from another time whose heartache echoed in his own. Sleep didn't come easy. His mind kept returning to the letters, to the hidden story of love and loss. He wondered about Elias. Was he a different man than the one he had known? And who was M.H.? What had become of her and the child she mentioned? The next morning he woke up with a new purpose. These letters were more than just old papers. They were a key to understanding his family, his past, and maybe even himself. He knew he had to find out more. He spent the day walking through the small town nearby, asking questions quietly, trying not to raise suspicion. The older people remembered Elias, his grandfather, but few knew about Margaret Hayes, the woman he had loved. Most said she was a quiet, lonely woman who never married, always keeping to herself. The pieces didn't fit. but he was determined to put them together. Back at the cabin, he read the letters again, memorizing every word, every sentence filled with longing and hope. The letters revealed a side of his grandfather no one talked about, a man caught between duty and desire, loyalty and heartbreak. That evening he sat beneath the dying oak tree. The wind rustled the leaves and the sun dipped below the horizon. He imagined the woman waiting there, hoping for a future that never came. He realized the tree wasn't just a tree. It was a witness to a love story, a keeper of secrets. And now those secrets were his to carry. He couldn't stop thinking about the letters. Every day, he returned to the cabin, sitting at the old wooden table with the tin box open in front of him. The letters from the past were like whispers calling out across time, filling his mind with questions he needed answers to. The woman who wrote them, M.H., was more than just a mystery now. She felt real, like someone he might have known. Her words were full of hope, pain, and a deep love that never faded, even though the years had passed. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered softly through the trees, he carefully unfolded another letter. The handwriting was delicate, but the words were strong. "Elias," it began, "I don't know how much longer I can wait. Every day feels like a test of my heart. I keep coming back to the tree hoping you will be there, but the silence grows louder. If you don't come on the 9th of October, I will understand." He paused and looked out the window at the very tree he had cut open. It was the same tree, the one where she waited. It made his chest tighten. Why had his grandfather never talked about this? Why had he hidden these letters away? He knew he needed to find out more. The letters mentioned a child, a promise, and pain that was never healed. If he could uncover the truth about M.H. and Elias, maybe he could find some peace for himself too. The next day, he decided to visit the local library. It was an old brick building with tall windows and dusty shelves filled with books and newspapers. He hoped he might find something, anything, that would give him a clue about M.H. He spent hours scrolling through old newspaper archives and town records on the computer. After some digging, he found a name that matched the initials, Margaret Hayes. There was a small photo of her from a yearbook, a young woman with kind eyes and a quiet smile. The photo was faded but still full of life. Margaret had lived in this town all her life, according to the records. She never married, never left. The articles mentioned her as a school teacher who cared deeply for her students. But nothing was said about the letters or the secret love story. He felt a connection growing stronger, like Margaret's story was part of his own. Outside the library, the sun was warm and the streets were quiet. He thought about what it would mean if Margaret had loved his grandfather, and if that love had been real and complicated. It was as if a part of his family's past was finally coming to light. On a quiet afternoon, he visited the small cemetery at the edge of town. The headstones were worn with age, but among them he found Margaret Hayes. Her grave was simple, surrounded by wildflowers and soft grass. He stood there, feeling a strange mix of sadness and respect. As he looked around, an older woman approached slowly. She introduced herself as a relative of Margaret's niece who still lived nearby. After some gentle questions, the woman gave him a name, Emily Hayes, and a phone number. He hesitated but called the number that evening. A nervous voice answered. He explained who he was and why he was calling. At first, Emily was cautious, but when he mentioned the letters, she grew quiet. They agreed to meet the next day at a small cafe in town. When they sat down across from each other, Emily's eyes filled with tears. She said she had heard stories about Margaret's past but never knew the full truth. "I always wondered," she said softly, "if Aunt Margaret had someone she loved, someone she lost." He showed Emily the letters. As she read, her expression changed from sadness to shock. "These letters, I've never seen them before," she whispered. But the pain in her words is clear. She told him about a photo Margaret had kept hidden, a baby wrapped in a soft blanket. The photo was dated the same year the letters mentioned a child. "This baby," Emily said, "was always a secret. We never knew who the father was or if he ever came back." The weight of this secret pressed heavily on him. The baby, the child Margaret wrote about. Could it be connected to his family? Could his own father be part of this hidden story? He shared what he knew about his grandfather, Elias, the man in the letters. Emily nodded, her eyes shining with tears. The family always believed Margaret's child was never claimed. But this changes everything. Together they decided to search through old town records and birth certificates. The hours they spent uncovered more questions but also hope. They found a birth record for a boy born to Margaret Hayes in the same year the letters mentioned. The name on the certificate was different, though. It was the name of a man Margaret never mentioned, a man no one in town knew much about. He felt the pieces falling into place but also felt overwhelmed. The truth was coming out, but it was complicated and painful. That night he sat by the fireplace, the letters spread out around him. He thought about his own life, his father's silence, the distance he always felt. Maybe his father was the child Margaret wrote about. Maybe the pain and secrets had passed from one generation to the next. He looked outside at the stars shining through the trees. The past wasn't just history. It was alive, and it was calling him to understand it. The tree, the letters, Margaret and Elias, they were all part of a story that needed to be told, and he was the one who had found it. He felt the weight of the past pressing down on him like never before. The letters had opened a door, and now he was stepping deeper into a story tangled with love, loss, and family secrets. There was no turning back. The photo Emily showed him of the baby stayed in his mind. The little face, the soft blanket, the note that said it was for Elias, our son. It was impossible to ignore. What if the child was his father? That would change everything he thought he knew about his family. Determined to learn more, he set out to find Emily again. They agreed to meet at the small-town library, a quiet place with old books and long wooden tables. Together they searched through more records, birth certificates, school reports, and old letters tucked away in dusty drawers. The more they found, the clearer the picture became, but it was still incomplete. The name on the birth certificate was not his grandfather's. It was someone else, a man no one in town spoke of. This only added to the mystery. Emily shared stories she had heard from family members, whispers passed down like fragile secrets. Margaret had fallen in love with a man who left town before the child was born. Elias had cared deeply for Margaret, but the timing was complicated. He had a family of his own to consider, responsibilities that tied him to the town and the cabin. He thought about his own father and the silence that surrounded him. Maybe the past had been too painful to share. Maybe the truth had been locked away in that tree, hidden like the letters. One afternoon they decided to visit an old friend of Elias's, a man who still lived nearby and remembered the days long gone. The man was in his 80s, slow-moving but sharp of mind. He welcomed them into his small house, walls lined with photographs and memories. They told him about the letters and the hidden story. He sighed deeply and nodded. "Yes, I remember," he said quietly. Elias was a good man, but life wasn't always kind to him. Margaret, she was someone special. They loved each other, but things didn't work out. Elias had a family, and that held him back. He told them about the promise Elias made to keep Margaret's secret safe, to protect the child as best he could without breaking his own family apart. It was a hard choice, the man said, but sometimes love means letting go. That night he walked back to the cabin with new thoughts swirling in his mind. The old oak tree was gone now, replaced by a new sapling planted carefully in its place. It was a small symbol of hope and healing. He sat down next to the young tree, the cool earth beneath him. He thought about Margaret and Elias, about their love and their pain, about the child who had grown up without knowing the full story. He reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the letters. He read the words again, imagining the woman who wrote them, waiting by the tree, hoping for a future that never came. His phone rang, breaking the quiet. It was his father. The call was unexpected, and he felt a sudden rush of emotion. They talked for a long time, cautiously at first, then more openly. For the first time in years, they shared pieces of their past. His father spoke softly about the silence, about things left unsaid, about regrets. He didn't know all the answers, but wanted to understand. It was a beginning. Days later, he received a package in the mail. Inside was a photograph, a picture of his grandfather, Elias, standing next to Margaret, both young and full of hope. There was a note on the back. "For you, to know where you come from." He held the photo close, feeling a connection across time and generations. The story was no longer just about letters in a tree. It was about family, about love that survives even in silence, and about the courage to uncover the truth. He looked out at the small tree outside the cabin. It was growing slowly, but it was alive. And so was he. The days were growing shorter, and the air had that cool, sharp edge that told him autumn was coming. But inside the small cabin, the walls seemed warmer now. The discovery of the letters and the slow unraveling of his family's hidden past had changed something inside him. He felt more connected to the place, to the people he never really knew, and to the truth that was finally coming to light. He spent many hours with Emily, sharing stories, searching records, and trying to understand the full picture. Their connection grew beyond just family history. She had a kindness about her that made the weight of the past a little easier to carry. One afternoon, they sat at the old wooden table in the cabin, surrounded by stacks of papers and photos. Emily pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age. "I found this in my aunt's things," she said softly. "It's a letter Elias wrote but never sent. I think she kept it safe." He carefully opened the envelope and pulled out the letter. The handwriting was firm but carried a sadness that made his heart ache. "Margaret," it began, "I wish I could explain everything to you. Life has pulled us apart, but you and the child will always be in my heart. I'm sorry for the silence. I'm sorry for the pain. I hope one day you can forgive me." He read the letter slowly, feeling the weight of the words. This was the other side of the story, the side his grandfather never shared with anyone. Questions swirled in his mind. Why hadn't Elias come back? Why had he stayed silent for so many years? Emily looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. "Maybe he was trying to protect the family he already had," she said. "Maybe he didn't know how to face the truth." They both knew the silence had caused more pain than words ever could. As the days passed, he felt the need to confront his father. The man had always been distant, quiet, and mysterious. Now, with the new knowledge of the past, he wanted to break through the walls that had separated them for so long. He called his father again, this time with a mix of hope and fear. The conversation was awkward at first, but as they talked, small cracks appeared in the silence. His father shared memories of his own childhood, moments of loneliness, and feelings he never expressed before. He learned that his father had always suspected something about Margaret and the child, but had chosen to keep the past buried to avoid more pain. The truth was messy. It was filled with regret and sorrow, but also with love that had never died. Encouraged by the new openness, he suggested they meet in person. It was the first time in many years they would see each other face to face. The meeting was quiet and careful, but it was a beginning, a step toward healing. Back at the cabin, he thought about the child mentioned in the letters. Was it his father? Or someone else? Emily helped him search through more old records, school reports, and local news articles. Slowly, they pieced together the story of a boy who had grown up without knowing his full family history. The boy was his father. The discovery was both shocking and comforting. It explained so much, the distance, the silence, the pain, but it also gave him a chance to understand his father in a new way. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he stood outside the cabin, looking at the small oak sapling. It had grown stronger, leaves reaching toward the sky. He thought about the generations that had come before him, the secrets, the love, the losses, and he realized that the tree was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, new life could grow. He took a deep breath and felt a strange sense of peace. The past was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He was ready to write his own story. The days felt different now. The heavy silence that had surrounded the past was lifting slowly, like morning fog burning away under the sun. He felt lighter. Though the journey had been hard, filled with questions and pain, it also brought something he hadn't expected: hope. After the meeting with his father, things began to change. It wasn't a sudden shift, but small moments, quiet talks, shared memories, a few smiles. The distance between them started to close. He still spent much of his time at the cabin, surrounded by the letters and the stories of a love long gone, but never forgotten. The sapling that had been planted where the old oak once stood grew a little stronger each day. He liked to think it was a symbol, not just of new life, but of new beginnings. One chilly morning, as autumn leaves floated down softly outside, he sat by the fireplace reading the last letter in the box. It was from Margaret, the woman whose words had changed everything. "I hope you find peace someday," she had written. "Even if it's not with me, I want you to live a full life. I will always love you no matter what. The words struck him deeply. Love, loss, forgiveness. These were not just words in an old letter. They were the threads that connected generations, binding the past to the present. He thought about Margaret's courage, waiting by the tree year after year, hoping for a future that never came. He thought about Elias, the grandfather he never Rai. Ely knew but now felt close to in a way he never imagined, and he thought about himself, what he had lost and what he had yet to find. The past was not perfect. It was messy and painful, full of silence and secrets, but it was real, and now it was his story too. One afternoon he invited Emily to the cabin. Together they looked through everything they had found, letters, photos, records. The pieces fit together now, creating a picture of love that was complicated but true. "We should share this," Emily said quietly. "This story needs to be told," he agreed. The idea of sharing their family's hidden history was scary, but also freeing. It was a way to honor Margaret and Elias, to bring their story out of the shadows. They started writing, putting the letters and memories together. They reached out to other family members, some of whom had never heard the full story. It was emotional, sometimes painful, but it brought them closer. Slowly, the silence that had ruled their family for so long began to break. He found himself thinking more about the future, about what kind of life he wanted to live, the kind of family he wanted to build. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer held him back. One evening, as the sky turned pink and orange, he walked through the forest near the cabin. The new oak tree stood tall, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze. He touched its bark, feeling the rough texture under his fingers. He thought about the letters hidden inside the old tree, the secret love they revealed, and the family that grew from that love. It was a story of pain, yes, but also of resilience and hope. He smiled quietly to himself. The past had shaped him, but it didn't define him. The future was his to write. He never imagined how one moment could change everything. The day he cut open that old tree had begun like any other, quiet, slow, peaceful. But that moment, when he found the letters, everything shifted. Now, months later, he found himself standing at the edge of the small town, the memories swirling like the crisp autumn wind. He thought about the path he had traveled, from the first letter to the truth about Margaret and Elias, to the fragile peace he was beginning to find with his father. The past wasn't behind him. It was part of him, but it no longer weighed him down. He felt ready to move forward. Life wasn't simple, and neither was love. He had learned that. The story he uncovered was full of pain and sacrifice, but it was also full of hope. In the weeks after deciding to share the story, more and more people came forward. Some had heard pieces before, but never the whole truth. Others were surprised, even shocked. But slowly the community began to understand. Margaret, once a quiet schoolteacher, became a symbol of strength and love. Elias, the grandfather who had been a mystery, was now a man with a real story, full of mistakes but also courage. The letters were no longer hidden secrets but pieces of history that brought people together. He spent long evenings talking with Emily and family members. They planned to create a small exhibit at the local museum, a way to honor Margaret, Elias, and the child they had never forgotten. The project gave him a new purpose. It was a way to connect the past and the future, to heal wounds that had been open for too long. One evening, after a long day of organizing photos and letters, he sat quietly on the porch of the cabin. The stars were bright and the air smelled like pine and earth. His phone rang. It was his father. This time the conversation was different. They spoke about things that mattered, about memories, regrets, and hopes. His father told stories he had never shared before. Stories about his own childhood, about the quiet pain of growing up without knowing all the answers. He listened closely, realizing how much his father had carried in silence. For the first time, they laughed together. It was a small but powerful moment, a sign that healing was possible. Days later, he took a walk through the forest near the cabin. The oak tree was no longer just a tree. It was a symbol of the past, but also of the future. He imagined Margaret sitting by it, waiting with hope. He imagined Elias standing beside her, torn but loving. He thought about the child, the life that grew from love and hardship, a life that had been shaped by silence but now had a voice. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey, for the letters that changed everything, for the family who finally found each other. He knew there would still be challenges. The past was complicated and healing took time, but he was ready. The story wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about living fully, with truth and love, and that was the greatest gift of all. The morning light came gently through the windows of the cabin, casting soft shadows across the wooden floor. He sat quietly, a cup of coffee warming his hands, thinking about how far things had come since the day he found the letters inside the tree. There was still so much to learn, but he felt ready now. The pain of the past had not disappeared, but it had softened. It no longer held him captive. He thought about the people he had met, Emily, the kind woman who helped him uncover the story, his father, who had finally begun to open his heart, and Margaret and Elias, whose love had lived on through the years. The letters had been the beginning, but the story was much bigger than words on paper. It was about life, loss, hope, and the power of truth. That day he decided to visit the local museum again. The exhibit they had been planning was almost ready. Photos, letters, and stories were carefully arranged, telling the tale of a love that had changed a family forever. As he walked through the small town, he noticed the faces of people he had come to know, neighbors, friends, even strangers who had been touched by the story. He felt a quiet pride knowing that what had been hidden for so long was finally being shared. At the museum, Emily greeted him with a smile. Together they made final touches, arranging the letters and photographs with care. "This will help people understand," she said softly. "Not just the story of Margaret and Elias, but the story of love and forgiveness." He nodded. The journey had taught him that stories like these were important. They showed that even in the darkest times there was light. Later that afternoon, a group gathered at the museum for the opening of the exhibit. Some were family members, others were townspeople who wanted to learn more. The room was filled with quiet conversation and thoughtful looks. He stood at the front and spoke about the letters, the discovery, and what it had meant to him. His voice was steady but full of emotion. "This story is about more than the past," he said. "It's about healing, connection, and the courage to face the truth. I hope it will inspire others to do the same." After the talk, people came forward to share their own stories. Some spoke of family secrets, lost loved ones, and the importance of forgiveness. He realized that everyone carried their own hidden stories, some painful, some hopeful. And sharing them made a difference. Days turned into weeks and life settled into a new rhythm. The oak sapling outside the cabin was growing taller, its branches reaching toward the sky. He spent time with his father more often now, walking through the woods, talking about everything and nothing. He even began to write down the full story, letters, memories, and all, hoping one day it would be a book that others could read and learn from. One evening, as the sun set in a sky painted with pink and gold, he sat by the fire with Emily and his father. They shared stories, laughter, and moments of quiet reflection. The past was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. It was part of the foundation on which they could build something new. As he looked at the flames flickering and the faces around him, he felt a deep sense of peace. The letters hidden inside that old tree had changed the course of his life forever. And now, he was ready to live fully, with an open heart and a clear mind. The days moved gently into weeks, and the quiet town began to feel different to him. It was no longer just a place where his family's past had been hidden. It was a place filled with stories, with lives connected by love and loss, hope and healing. He often walked through the forest near the cabin, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the scent of pine and earth fresh in the air. The small oak tree, once just a sapling, was growing steadily. It stood as a symbol of all that had changed, and all that was still possible. The exhibit at the museum had brought people together. It was more than just a collection of letters and photos. It was a way to remember, to forgive, and to begin again. One afternoon, he found himself sitting on a bench outside the cabin, looking at the oak tree. A gentle breeze moved the leaves, making soft rustling sounds. He thought about the journey, the long search for answers, the pain of discovery, the fragile threads of connection woven between generations. His thoughts drifted to the future. What did it hold? Could he build something new, stronger than the silence that had come before? He smiled quietly to himself. The past was no longer a chain holding him back. It was a foundation solid and real. He pulled out a notebook and began to write, not just the story of Margaret and Elias, but his own story, the story of a family who learned to face the truth and, in doing so, found a way to heal. Writing brought him a sense of peace. Each word was a step forward, a way to understand and to forgive. Sometimes, Emily would come by and sit with him, sharing her thoughts and helping him organize the pieces of the story. Their friendship had grown strong, built on trust and shared purpose. He thought about his father, too. The man who had once been so distant was now a steady presence in his life. They still had much to work through. But the walls between them were crumbling. One evening, they sat by the fire, sharing stories from their past and dreams for the future. It was a moment he would remember, a quiet night filled with connection and hope. Life was not perfect. There were still difficult days, moments when the weight of the past felt heavy again, but now, he knew he was not alone. He had family, friends, and a community that cared. The letters he found in the tree had opened a door. Beyond it lay a path filled with truth and love, and he was walking it step by step. The oak tree outside the cabin continued to grow, its branches reaching higher each day. It was a living reminder that even after years of silence and secrets, life could renew itself. And so could he. The air was crisp with the approach of early winter. The forest around the cabin stood quiet and still, the trees shedding their last leaves, readying for the cold months ahead. He sat by the window, looking out at the small oak tree, now much taller and stronger than when he first saw it. Its branches stretched toward the sky, a silent testament to growth and resilience. The story that had begun with the discovery of letters inside that old tree had changed his life completely. It had reshaped how he saw his family, his past, and even himself. The past, with all its pain and secrets, was no longer a heavy weight on his shoulders. Instead, it was a part of his story, a chapter that had taught him about love, forgiveness, and the strength to move forward. Over the months, he had grown closer to the people who mattered most. Emily, who had been by his side through the search, had become a dear friend. His father, once distant and quiet, had opened up, sharing stories and memories that had been locked away for years. Together, they had begun to heal the wounds left by years of silence. But healing was not a straight path. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when the memories felt overwhelming, and the loss seemed unbearable. Yet each time he found a way to push forward. He remembered a line from one of Margaret's letters. "In the darkest soil, the strongest roots grow." That truth stayed with him. One morning he decided to visit the town's library. He wanted to see if there were any more clues, old newspaper articles, records, anything that could shed light on the life his grandparents had lived. As he carefully turned through fragile pages of a local history book, he found an article about a community event Margaret had organized many years ago. It described her as a kind and dedicated teacher who cared deeply for her students. He smiled softly, imagining her standing there, full of hope and strength despite everything she had endured. The story was no longer just about loss. It was about the impact one person could have on many lives. He thought about the importance of sharing stories, of preserving memories so that they could inspire others. Back at the cabin, he sat down to write again. This time he focused on the lessons learned, the importance of truth, the power of forgiveness, and the courage to face difficult emotions. Writing felt like a conversation with himself, a way to understand the past and prepare for the future. Emily stopped by that afternoon, bringing warm tea and a smile. They talked for hours about the exhibit, the upcoming community gathering, and their hopes for what might come next. The exhibit had sparked more interest than they expected. People wanted to share their own stories, to connect and heal. He realized the story of Margaret and Elias was not just theirs anymore. It belonged to everyone willing to listen. As winter settled in, the small oak tree outside stood bare but strong, its roots deep in the earth. It was a reminder that even in the coldest seasons, life continued beneath the surface. He felt ready to face whatever came next. The past had shaped him, but it did not define him. The story that began with a tree and hidden letters was still unfolding, and he was grateful to be part of it. The winter days were quiet but full of meaning. Snow blanketed the town softly, covering rooftops, streets, and the forest around the cabin. He watched the snow fall from the window, feeling the calm settle over everything. This time of year brought reflection. The year had been full of changes, some painful, some healing. The story he had uncovered inside that old tree had become more than just a discovery. It had become a journey of understanding himself, his family, and the meaning of love. He thought about the many people who had joined him on this path: Emily, his father, and the community that had come together to share stories and support one another. The exhibit at the museum had been a success. It touched many hearts and opened doors for conversations that had long been avoided. He felt a quiet pride knowing that what had once been a secret was now a source of strength and connection. One morning, bundled in a warm coat, he stepped outside into the crisp air. The oak tree stood tall, its branches bare but strong against the winter sky. He reached out to touch its rough bark and thought about how much the tree had witnessed. It held the past in its rings and now held the future in its growing branches. That day he decided to write a letter, not to anyone in particular, but to the story itself. To the love that had been hidden, the pain that had been endured, and the hope that had grown from it all. He wrote about forgiveness, about the courage to face the truth, even when it hurts. He wrote about the power of connection and the importance of sharing stories. Writing was no longer just a way to process the past. It had become a way to create a future. As the weeks passed, he continued to work on the book about his family's story. It was a project close to his heart, a way to give voice to those who had been silent for so long. Emily helped him organize the letters, photos, and memories. They talked about how this story could help others who were struggling with their own family secrets and pain. The book was not just history, it was a message of hope. One evening, they sat by the fire in the cabin, the warm glow lighting their faces. They talked about dreams for the future, about building lives filled with honesty, love and forgiveness. He felt grateful for the journey, the pain and the healing, the loss and the love. The story that began with cutting open an old tree and finding hidden letters had changed his life in ways he never imagined. It had shown him that even in the darkest times, there was a chance for new beginnings. The past was part of him, but it was not the whole story. He was ready to live the rest of his life with an open heart. The oak tree outside stood tall, a symbol of endurance and growth, and so was he.